Hi, I'm Natasha.
And I'm Cassandra.
And this is Strange Sisters. And today is an episode that I've been really looking forward to. We're going to talk about time slips, which is something that I think is really fascinating. But before we get into that, I just wanted to mention Michelle Trachtenberg. On the day that we're recording this, it's actually just the day after she passed away. And she was such an icon. Harriet the Spy was like our favorite movie for years. We watched it all the time, and we definitely wanted to be her. And she was in so many other great films too. She was absolutely amazing in Buffy, Ice Princess. She was in Eurotrip. She was in so many iconic millennial movies. And I was really looking forward to seeing her in the Buffy reboot. And I'm just so sad that she passed away. I'm so sorry to all her friends and family for their loss. And she will be sorely missed. So I just felt like we needed to mention her before we moved on because she was such a big part of our childhood.
I didn't even know that happened.
Yeah, they just announced that she passed away yesterday.
Oh.
I don't think they've announced how yet. Last I heard, there was no suspicion of foul play, so
That's awful.
I guess we'll see what happens. But yeah, she was such a big part of our childhood, and I just absolutely loved her. She was such a talented actress, and she seemed like a really great person, too.
Oh.
R.I.P. Michelle, we will definitely miss you in the Buffy reboot and in all the awesome roles you could have played, in the future.
Sad.
I know. Harriet the Spy was like, we watched that.
I was just
probably
talking
at
about
least
that.
once a week, like all the time. She was the first Nickelodeon movie star. Like that was the first Nickelodeon movie that ever came out, and that was our favorite movie.
Oh yeah, I loved Ice Princess too.
Mm-hmm. She was so good in Ice Princess. She was great in everything. She was just such a talented actress.
Sad.
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention that before moving forward. Not that I think that any of her friends or family will hear it, but on the off chance that they do, we're really sorry for your loss.
It's nice to put into the world anyway that what your work did matter to people and you'll be remembered for it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
That's sad.
Yeah, so, all right, we'll get back to our episode for today, which, as I mentioned, is time slips. And Cassandra's going to call me a huge dork because I'm going to quote Doctor Who right now.
Lance loves Doctor Who.
Wait, what?
Lance loves Doctor Who.
Oh,
and so does Cousin Emily.
Yeah, Doctor Who is awesome, but it's not for everyone. Not everyone understands the awesomeness of it. But to quote him, people assume that time is a strict progression of cause to effect, but actually, from a nonlinear, non-subjective viewpoint, it's more like a big ball of wibbly wobbly, timey wimey stuff. So you've probably heard the timey wimey stuff before. A lot of people say that. And that's how I've always kind of looked at time. Like, I'm hesitant to say this because I don't know if our parents are going to listen, but the first time I did mushrooms, my big revelation was that time is not real. It's just something that we made up. And I think that's kind of true in a way. We look at things in a very linear way, but maybe that's not necessarily the case. And so I've pretty much been interested in time slips and things like that since that occurrence. So yeah, we're going to get into a couple cases that are really interesting. And both of them were actually written about in books. But before we get into that, I'll talk a little bit about the physics of it. Not that I'm an expert by any means, but there is no scientific reasoning that proves that time slips are real. And our current understanding of physics does not support the possibility of time slips, mainly because that the theory of relativity does not provide any mechanism for time travel, and that entropy is a closed system, always increasing, so meaning that going back in time would violate the fundamental principle of it, basically. So despite this, there have been numerous firsthand accounts of this phenomenon through the ages, and some people attribute these experiences to psychological factors like cognitive biases, deja vu, which is like a whole other thing that I'm sure we'll get into in a different time, memory errors, or strong emotions that distort the perception of time, which, sure, all those things could happen, but some of these things just, I think, go beyond that. or even factors like extreme stress, fatigue, or altered states of consciousness could also contribute to unusual perceptions of time. While some instances, like I said, could definitely be attributed to this, the following accounts certainly lend credibility to the concept despite the lack of scientific evidence.
Well, and two things can be true at once. Like, you could be suffering all of these things, but still have a time slip.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, and just because science right now doesn't prove it, that doesn't mean that in the future it can be proven. I mean, we're just limited by what's studied, which is basically limited by what's funded, right? So
Yeah.
you can't necessarily get funding to study time slips. I mean, I would think that there's some secret government laboratory that is studying time, because going back in time, you could change a lot of things. Who knows? That's a little X-Files-y, but
That's
you
the
never
only
know.
thing I can remember when you mentioned time slips is the one specific episode of the X-Files.
Oh, I don't remember the time slip one.
It ends
I'll
with
have to
them
go back.
sitting in like a parked car in a road. But even Lance doesn't think time's linear either. And he's a physics teacher, so you've got that on your side.
Interesting. Yeah. Like I said, yeah, I think it's just really based on funding. You know, it's not like in the old, I mean, it kind of is in the olden days where rich people would just finance scientists to study things. You can still get obviously grants and things like that to study things that people are, you know, interested in that might not be within the realm of what's considered important. There's a lot of other really important things that need to be studied. Yeah. So I think this kind of takes a backseat, which is totally understandable. So the first one that we're going to talk about that I thought was really fascinating is the case of Irene Corbally Kuhn. On a pleasant December day in 1925, Irene Corbally Kuhn was in great spirits while taking a stroll down Michigan Boulevard in Chicago, when suddenly her world was turned completely upside down. In her 1938 memoir, Assigned to Adventure, she describes her truly unsettling experience. And this is, I'm going to quote her book quite often. So, suddenly and without warning, boulevard, people, lake, everything vanished, wiping from my vision as completely and quickly as if I had been struck blind. Before me, as on a motion picture screen in a dark theater, unrolled a strip of green grass within a fence of iron palings. 3 young trees in spring verdure stood on one side. Beside the trees and the fence, in the far distance, factory smokestacks trailed sooty plumes across the sky. Across from the trees stood a small circle of people, men and women, a mere handful, in black clothes. And coming to a halt on a graveled road by the grass was a limousine from which alighted 2 men who turned to offer their hands to a woman in black, emerging now from the car. The woman was I. I watched myself being escorted against my will to the group which now parted to receive me. I made no sound, but struggled against the necessity of moving towards them. I took one step and then stood stock still. Gently the 2 men urged me forward, a step at a time, until at last I was among the others and looked at the small hole cut in the grass, a hole not more than 2 feet square. I looked once and turned my back on it, wanting to run away, but held there by some irresistible force. There was a small box which someone, bending over now, was placing in the earth with infinite tenderness. A box so small and light I could hold it in my hand and hardly feel it. What was I doing here? Where was I? Why was I letting someone put this box into the ground? This little box which held something so precious to me. I couldn't speak or move. These people, who were they? Then I recognized only the faces of my husband's family, tear-stained and sad. The silence screamed and tore at me. I looked about. All the clan were there. Only he was missing. Then I knew it was in the box, and I crumpled on the grass without a sound. This is a harrowing story of Irene Corbally Kuhn's brief journey, unbeknownst to her, into the not-so-distant future. Irene, an NYC native born in 1898, was a well-respected journalist and author whose career spanned 7 decades and 5 continents. She was a pioneer in the field, being the first woman to broadcast from the Orient, and the first individual to broadcast from a U.S. Navy vessel. While on assignment in Shanghai, she fell deeply in love with Bert Kuhn, a fellow journalist, and the two married in 1922. After taking a leave of absence from the newspaper, moving to Hawaii, and giving birth to their daughter Renee, the young family returned to the Evening Star in Shanghai in 1923, where they stayed until May 1925, when riots erupted following a strike that turned deadly when 1 worker was killed and 7 others were wounded. As any good husband would be, Bert was deeply worried about his family's safety and convinced Irene to take Renee with her back to the States while he stayed in China to continue reporting. After the overwhelming event
So she, in her time slip, she saw her husband's funeral.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Just came on very suddenly. She was just like walking out on the street and all of a sudden, yeah. So it's really interesting to read it like from a book versus someone just kind of telling you about their experience.
Yeah.
Obviously this happened a long time ago, but she wrote about it not very, I mean, I guess it was maybe 13 years after it happened, but I'm sure she probably wrote about it in her diary. She told people about it, and then eventually she included it in her book. And her book wasn't only about this, like, the book was about her whole life. So this is just a snippet from her book, which is really interesting.
Did she ever write, she was a journalist, did she ever write about it in like a newspaper or anything? Do you know?
I don't think she wrote about it in a newspaper. I mean, at the time, like, women really weren't taken that seriously in journalism, so she probably didn't want to be seen as some like kook that lost her husband and was like just lost in grief. So yeah, I know she had a column, but I don't know if she actually wrote about it in her newspaper. She actually went on to have a show, I believe, as well with her daughter. But it doesn't seem like a necessarily like defining experience in her life, but it is something that, you know, obviously stuck with her given the situation.
Well, the only reason I ask that is because for a second, her and her husband both being journalists, it gave me War of the Worlds vibes.
Mhm.
Yeah, where I'm like, is she trying to sell papers? Is she trying to sound more interesting? But if she didn't really put it in a column, then it gave her no good. Like she gained nothing from it.
Yeah, yeah, and she went on to have a very successful career, so it's not like she was like grasping at straws or grasping for fame or anything like that. This is just something that happened to her,
Gotcha.
basically. Yeah, so very interesting. And after that overwhelming event in December of 1925, she was obviously deeply shaken, and which was compounded by the fact that her husband was so far away. You know, she was in Chicago and he was in China, which is very far distance. And it's not like you can call some or FaceTime someone, you know, like you can now. This is literally 100 years ago. And a passerby, seeing that she was super distressed, rushed to her aid and called her a cab that took her to her brother-in-law's office. Despite her best efforts to convince herself what she had seen was simply a figment of her imagination, the vision stuck with her for months to come. In February 1926, Irene was excited to finally head back to China to be with her husband and was preparing to embark on a voyage from Vancouver, which I can't even imagine. Taking a ship all the way from Vancouver to China must be really scary in its own right.
In the way that I don't go in the woods, the way you're not going to catch me on the ocean like that. Absolutely
No,
not.
no, no. That's just like wide open ocean. That no, no, thank
We're
you.
not good swimmers.
I mean, even if you're a great swimmer, you're not going to swim like thousands of miles. So yeah, no. But yeah, she was on her way back. She was really excited. And as soon as she stepped on board the ship, she was advised to contact the passenger agent, who presented her with a wire from Bert's family in Chicago.
Oh
The
no.
wire read, "Please inform Mrs. Bert L. Kuhn that her husband is dangerously ill. It would be best not to sail." So, upon disembarking from the ship, she received another wire delivering the tragic news that Bert had passed away. She was so close to seeing him again, and unfortunately, he passed away before she could get there.
That's awful.
Yeah. And of course, she was devastated and returned to Chicago right away to be with her family. But she found some comfort in her new job at the Mirror, while Bert's family made arrangements for his funeral stateside. On May 30th, 1926, less than a year after her vision on Michigan Boulevard, Irene, accompanied by her two brother-in-laws, rode in a limousine to Roseville Cemetery to lay Bert to rest. And this is another quote from her book. "We drove across the city, through the cemetery gates, and came to a stop. The men got out first and waited to help me. I put my foot on the ground and something held me back. For a second I couldn't raise my eyes because I knew what I would see. At last I looked. There was the spring grass underfoot. There was 3 young trees in fresh leaf. There was the fence of iron palings, and the smokestacks and the city's industries far beyond in the distance. My feet were weighted with lead. I didn't want to go. Bert's brother urged me forward gently. I saw the ring of black-clad mourners over to one side waiting. I stopped. She said, 'You didn't have to open a full grave, did you?' 'How do you know?' asked Paul with astonishment. There was just a little square big enough to take Bert's ashes, isn't there? Paul's face was white beneath his natural tan. Yes, that's right. They said it would be foolish to open a full grave for such a small box of ashes. But how did you know? I didn't answer. I was thinking of that December day on Michigan Boulevard when I had seen into the future, over the bridge of time. Adding to this mysterious situation, the circumstances surrounding Bert's death were also peculiar. The unknown cause of his death is amplified by the fact that Bert had been involved in covert operations with the U.S. Naval Intelligence. This led Irene to believe that his secretive endeavors may have played a role in his untimely demise.
So he wasn't gravely ill.
I mean, maybe. Maybe he got poisoned or something. You know, who knows? They really could say anything back then.
Yeah, especially if they just send you ashes. Like...
Right. Yeah, you can't even test the body, which I mean, I can understand because that's quite a long journey. I can't imagine how much it would cost to get a casket shipped over.
You'd have to keep it refrigerated.
Right.
So that makes sense, but I'm trying to figure out, I don't know if she explains later, what a specific time to like have a time slip into.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think it's obviously like emotions are very high. So, like, maybe that plays into why it happened. Because she doesn't mention any other times of this happening to her. So it just seemed like it was such a traumatic experience that it kind of like transcended time in a way.
Almost like a warning, you're gonna go through this. It might be better if you know now.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I'm sure in some way she always kind of had it in the back of her mind until this ended up happening. So, yeah, it's a really sad situation. And following her husband's death, she did not remarry, but she lived a long, accomplished career as a broadcaster, screenwriter, and author, and even had a radio feature show called The Coons, which she co produced with her daughter. And she passed away in 1995 at the age of 97.
Holy crap.
Yeah, so she lived a very long life, but she never remarried. Bert was definitely the love of her life, which is really sad.
Which then also kind of makes more sense into this is your warning.
Yeah, and they were together for such a short time, and they ended up being separated just for their work, and it's really sad. So some people will say, oh, well, maybe it was a psychic vision or a parallel universe, which is like a whole other theory that we'll definitely get into at some point. But I think it's like a really compelling case for time slips, and it's not really all that widely discussed. I don't know if it's because it's in a book. You know, a lot of people don't usually turn to memoirs for this type of stuff. So, yeah, I thought that was a really cool one to discuss, and very accomplished woman. And I think she has a lot of credibility, obviously, as a journalist. You know, she was a very accomplished journalist and didn't, like we were saying, didn't use this opportunity to like make money or anything like that. Like it was just something that happened to her. Although I'm sure it did help her book sales once people started reading it. So there's that. But she also did so many other things that, you know, it wasn't the only thing of notoriety in her book.
Well, in that day and age, too, that wasn't like the thing. Having paranormal or alien or whatever experiences was frowned upon mostly. So
yeah, you were labeled crazy, basically. So
it's probably best that she didn't say anything. I don't know if she could have still been put away at that point. A widow who saw the future.
Yeah, that's true. You never know. Yeah, that was her story, and I have another story that was also written about in a book. This happened to two people at the same time, which is also very interesting. So I'll kind of paraphrase their book as well. So this is the Versailles Palace time slip.
Versailles,
On a warm summer, yeah.
Okay, you just had to clarify.
Yeah, which is really interesting too. I mean, obviously that place has a lot of energy just with, you know, the royalty that lived there and all the people visiting, and yeah, so very interesting place. And on a warm summer day in August of 1901, Eleanor and Annie, vice principal and principal at St. Hugh's College in Oxford, visited the stunning Versailles Palace. They hopped on the train from Paris to Versailles, and upon arrival, began their tour with a visit to the long rooms and galleries of the Versailles Palace. After roaming around the grounds a bit, they strolled over to the Petit Trianon, a smaller home by palatial standards that Louis XI gave to his wife Marie Antoinette, who loved spending time there prior to the French Revolution. Following their guidebook, they passed the Grand Trianon, and suddenly the atmosphere felt different. They accidentally missed the path leading to the Petit Trianon, and instead continued on a different route. Along this path, Annie saw a woman lean out of the window in a nearby building to shake a dust cloth, which was a bit strange, but not totally unheard of. Obviously, people are cleaning these buildings. Soon they found their path split into three, and unsure of which way to take, they decided to ask two men ahead of them who were pushing a wheelbarrow, assuming that they worked on the property. The men were wearing three-point velvet hats, again, pretty odd, since this was 1901, but they likely chalked it up to workers wearing time-appropriate attire, to lend to the authenticity of the experience.
They're really just letting everything go. Like, they're just excusing everything.
Well, I mean, if you've never been somewhere before, I guess, you don't really know what it's going to be like. And people dress up in, timey things for, other type of events, too. So I guess it's not totally out of the ordinary.
I mean, that's fair. Whenever we go to Gettysburg, there's always reenactors dressed up.
Right.
I guess you do kind of just ignore it, and you're just, writing it off as that's what's happening.
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, it wouldn't have been that big of a time span, I guess, because this is 1901. So it only would have been 150 years or something like that. So they spoke with the men who directed them, and then they went on their way. The two women followed the directions, but the path ended and connected with another at an odd angle, leading in a different direction. This path was especially strange, dividing the lush lawn of the property with wild land with leaves and tufts of grass scattered around. So it's like the manicured side, then all of a sudden on the other side is
where the servants' quarters would have been.
Yeah, maybe, but you would think the whole grounds would be fairly manicured. I'm not really sure about that. So, already creeped out by the change in vibe and environment, the women came upon a man leaning against a bandstand with his back towards them, wearing the same type of clothing as the two men they had asked directions for earlier. When the man turned to face them, his face was distorted and scary. Turning away to avoid the man, they saw another man come up to them, and when they asked for directions, he spoke in a strange accent that was difficult to understand, then ran off into the woods. Okay. So I don't know if, as they're seeing them in their time period clothing, are these guys seeing them in their time period clothing? Because it's very different attire, obviously, than what you would wear in the 1700s.
I mean, for women in 1901, was it that different? I think they weren't allowed to wear pants yet, so.
No, but I think it was pretty different. Even if you were a woman of lower status or whatever, I think the style was fairly different.
I mean, absolutely, they didn't have big skirts and giant wigs, but for day to day, I think they still had larger skirts and a corset.
Yeah, I mean, they just looked odd to each other.
Interesting question. Are the people there sentient to know that they're there at a different time?
Yeah, it's a really interesting situation because they're actually interacting with these people. It's not like they're just seeing them, they're actually talking to them and asking them for directions. So very strange. So yeah, he just, ran off into the woods for some reason.
As one does.
And they quickly lost sight of the man, but could still hear his footsteps as he ran across the dried leaves. So that's kind of weird, too. The pair followed the rough directions they could make out and finally made their way to the Petit Trianon. The yard around the property was wild and unmanicured, and they came upon a woman who was busily sketching, totally unaware of their presence. Eleanor remarked that the woman bore a striking resemblance to the painting she saw of Marie Antoinette, complete with a wide-brimmed white hat. The women ascended the stairs up to the top of the terrace, and upon reaching the top, looked down over the area and made eye contact with the woman sketching, whose face was suddenly very old. At this point, the pair were tired and unfazed when they saw and ran into a large man on the path in front of them. They asked the man for directions, and he indicated that they only needed to keep following the path they were already on. Eventually, they found their way back to the main part of the property, and again the atmosphere noticeably changed. In 1911, under pseudonyms, they wrote a book called An Adventure about their experience slipping back into time into 1789 and encountering the infamous Marie Antoinette. Numerous people have reported similar experiences since then with no reasonable explanation.
So they said that Marie Antoinette's face was old, like it turned old.
Yeah, like it suddenly turned old. So it seems like there's some kind of like a weird bubble of where two times are existing at the same time or something.
But Marie Antoinette didn't live to get old. She was
Yeah,
beheaded.
right.
But depending on the makeup she was using, I mean, they were using like lead and arsenic in their hair makeup and stuff.
Yeah, but I still don't think she would look very old.
I mean, she doesn't look like Kristen, what's her name that plays Marie Antoinette? Kirsten Dunst?
Oh, yeah.
But I have to wonder if there's written articles from like that time period of the gentleman and whoever they ran into being like, I saw the weirdest women dressed in the
Yeah.
strangest clothes walking around today.
Yeah. And if people are still experiencing that now, then that would be a totally different wardrobe, way of speaking, like everything.
And that makes me wonder, is it an intelligent haunting then? But I guess if the entire like ground and everything changed.
Yeah, it seems like it's in like its own little bubble of time or something like that. There was a movie I saw about that. I forget what it was called. But it was like about these brothers that lived in a cult growing up and they escaped and then when they went back like everyone was the same age.
I think I've seen that movie too.
I think it's called like The Endless or something like that. And then when they were trying to leave, they found all these other little pockets of time where there was one that was just like a 30-second long loop. That's a really trippy movie. Kind of messed up too. It's a very strange
Do
movie,
you
but
think there would be one movie that we talk about that's not kind of strange on this podcast? So far, we've done The
no.
House October Built, Hell House LLC. I mean,
Classic. I mean, those are the only kind of movies I watch. I don't watch like rom coms or anything. So, but yeah, that was a really interesting one. And we'll probably do some more on time slips in the future. There are a lot of instances of time slips that are written about, but I thought these two in particular were interesting because they were written about in books, and they both happened in the 1900s. So this is something that is not new. It's been going on for quite a while.
they really weren't that far time wise away from each other, too.
Yeah, only about like 24 years.
Trying to think, did anything like I mean, I'm sure I always make an ass of myself when I try to date things, but was anything really crazy happening within that like time frame?
No, I mean, one would have been before the war, and one would have been after the war.
So in the
I
middle
mean,
was
one,
war.
the what?
So in the middle was war, so that doesn't really help.
Yeah.
Huh.
I mean, one was in France and one was in the US. So,
I
yeah,
definitely
I don't know.
see the Versailles one. I mean, there's so much energy
Hmm.
there.
Yeah, I think that one definitely makes sense that it's in its own kind of little bubble of space and time. And I think a lot of people, a lot of individuals have experiences like or Irene Corbally Kuhn did when they go through something really traumatic. I think they're both pretty credible experiences, and hopefully we can find some more interesting ones from the early 1900s as well. I feel like the ones that are more recent, like there's not as much information for some reason. Like it's maybe just shared like a Reddit post or something like
Mhm.
that. They're not writing as much in depth as they would like in a book. So there are definitely other ones that I found that I'm sure we'll talk about in the future, or maybe we'll just do like a one-off jumble of all different
Yeah, all the
weird
other
things.
things were.
Hmm.
I thought there was
But yeah,
even more like aliens involved with time slips for some reason.
I know that like people will say that they'll, yeah, like time is weird. Like they'll be picked up and they'll feel like they're there for like days or weeks or months and then they get dropped off and it's just like seconds later or something like that. But yeah, neither of these mentioned aliens in any way.
Yeah. Hmm. Interesting.
So yeah, so if anyone listening has an experience with a time slip, we would love to hear about it. You can send us an email, strangesisterspod@gmail.com, or you can submit something to us online, either anonymously, or you can include your name if you want to on our website, strangesisterspod.com. And we will definitely share it on a future episode. So we would love to hear about it. And thanks for tuning in to this time slip episode. Hopefully we'll be able to do a lot more. And we'll catch you in the next one. Stay strange.